Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Stephen and the Academy, for asking me to speak this morning. And I'm glad you made that clarification, Tony. I do work in the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. Of course, Heritage, we're all the one again as a combined department. So as Tony mentioned, I work in the National, Regional and Urban Planning Division of the department. I'm part of a larger team, and my own core area is compact urban growth, urban regeneration. And I suppose that whole question about, when we know where the why and the where is from a national perspective, a lot of what we focus on is the how and the what. So I suppose this morning, I'm going to split my presentation into 4 parts. I'm not going to spend too much time at the first part, 2 parts, but I will look at the application end, I think as the Minister mentioned this morning, in terms of the Urban Regeneration Fund. So the first part really is just to do with context, and I don't have to mention to a huge number of colleagues I recognise this morning as to the kind of backdrop that we're all dealing with, particularly most acutely in the last, I suppose, 25 years, is one of sustainability, the climate agenda. And literally it is a question of resource, how you manage resources. We're all familiar with the consequences of sprawl and poor choices in terms of unsustainable development. And we know sometimes directly we see the consequences of, I suppose, those choices being borne out, not more immediately through the climate impacts, but also the impacts on our urban settlements. And there is that question then of how do you aspire to grow that compact urban growth agenda? Is there such a thing as the compact sustainable city? And I know particularly when dealing with, I suppose, sustainable development in the built environment sector, one would always say, well, look, the most sustainable building is one you already have and one that's in use. And maybe there's a lesson there in terms of settlements, maybe the most sustainable city is one we already have. We also understand that population growth and that move towards greater urbanization has been, I suppose, our focus across the globe, and particularly in Europe. And obviously, there's been very, very good research on that in the last 10 to 15 years, particularly from the London School of Economics. So I suppose in terms of the challenges, very briefly in terms of context, it's a burden we don't share alone, particularly in Ireland. We do have a very, very good co-sharing across the EU. We're very lucky to work within a system that allows us to participate in a lot of EU urban policy. And those on the call, I do see Henk Bouwman on the call as well, who would be very, very familiar with all of this. Last December, our junior Minister of State, Peter Burke, was a co-signatory on behalf of Ireland as member state to the new EU territorial agenda, which is the new spatial policy approach for the EU. And that was shored up by the revision to the previous Leipzig Charter from 2007. And that was really to focus on the one hand, the regional spatial approach in terms of cities, city regions, and growth, and the sort of issues that are common among all territories, coupled with the issues around cities and urban development. And again, these sort of issues we're dealing with are not unfamiliar to a lot of us across both Ireland and the UK, and indeed in Europe. And that was backed up by a formal mechanism called Council's Conclusions on Urban and Territorial Development. So it was given the backing to say this is a priority. And it's great to see that evolve. We were party to this in the early noughties. And again, it's great to see a refresh and a refocus on all of that. And obviously the backdrop to all of that is described as the urban agenda for the EU, which effectively did start as part of the Pact of Amsterdam during the Dutch presidency in 2016. And really it has been a great help and support to other governments and other departments across the EU to kind of co-share and look at this on a collaborative basis. And of course, that has demonstrated to us that the issue of cities and urban development is quite complex, but you can break it down. and you can actually discover that, in fact, the various pillars in terms of how we enable and promote compact urban growth in our various cities across the EU. And just to note, they are all different sizes, they're all different shapes. We in Ireland, we would have one large city and 4 small regional cities. So you can't really compare size across that broad agenda, but you can compare the approach, which is quite similar in terms of governance, in terms of what the software of cities is becoming, in terms of the digital transformation, climate action, smart cities, the just green transition. So there's a lot of things happening incrementally across that. And obviously, how do you translate those changes at the wider region level, the city level, and the neighborhood level? And I guess we as practitioners, I think that's where we, I suppose, try and understand that interaction at that local scale. And of course, other groups, the European, the Urban Knowledge Network, did a very, very good report in 2019 to look at that level of complexity. And of course, cities aren't static places. They're not, they're quite dynamic. For millennia, they have been the exchange of social, cultural, and economic exchange. And of course, with that, they're quite intricate in terms of the ecosystem that the city is. And of course, as practitioners, in terms of urban development, we've all been to the areas that we try and aspire to do or be. And obviously, I'm mentioning here the likes of Hamburg Hafen City Regeneration Project, which I think is Europe's largest brownfield regeneration project in a dockland setting, to Hammarby in Stockholm, which I think was kind of the very first at leading that climate action debate in terms of sustainable places and sustainable housing. So we do, we do try and co-share, we try and learn from each other, and I think that's the benefit of having that shared context. So in terms of vision, and I suppose at a national level here in Ireland, as the Minister mentioned this morning, since 2018, we have launched the new National Planning Framework, coupled with the National Development Plan. They are 2 sister documents that reciprocally depend on each other, and it's really aligning capital investment with the spatial strategy in effect. And I suppose the fact that we're able to align a capital investment envelope with the why and the where, with the how and the when maybe, I think that has been a huge step forward and a game changer in terms of that sort of level of approach. And again, focused on the structure of that, it does recognise the many sectors under the national strategic objectives that make up cities and regions and the national spatial approach in terms of all the various parts that actually make up, I suppose, a sustainable approach to development and spatial planning. So at the backdrop in 2018 was the 116 billion capital investment plan, which was co-shared among all departments and agencies, and obviously operationalized through the regional structures, through government departments down to local government level. So I suppose the key lesson here was it was to move away from that business as usual, but to look at new governance models in terms of the roles of the various institutions that have been set up to support that, like the Land Development Agency and the Office of Planning Regulator. And again, I suppose that's just a simple graphic to show, I suppose, that as the Minister mentioned, the challenge and opportunity of the primacy of Dublin, but also the challenge and opportunity to reinvest on a balanced regional basis to the other 4 regional cities, and indeed the key driver towns between that. And then again, I'll mention later in terms of town centres first. And I should say that's against a backdrop over the last number of years, since the early noughties, of an already established approach in our department to placemaking, the how-to. So we have been working away at those tools for quite some time. And I suppose that does enable the how, that you do have to have a big picture but fine grain approach in terms of actually mobilizing those ambitions. So maybe just, I suppose, to open it up, and I'm just checking my time here, I'm halfway through. So I suppose to talk about application, and this is where, as a colleague of mine said, this is where the rubber hits the road. You know, this is where we see, can we meet that ambition with the practical application of those sort of objectives. So in 2018, as a direct result of the National Planning Framework, the Urban Regeneration and Development Fund was initiated along with its sister fund, the Rural Regeneration Fund, and there was a cut-off point of the URDF was really focusing on urban settlements over the population of 10,000, and the Rural Fund under that. And it has been a kind of a neat, sometimes if not an artificial line, but it has been a dividing, a useful delineation between those two areas, and they've dovetailed very, very neatly in terms of the range and scale of projects. So very quickly, in terms of the URDF, we had an absolute huge response to an open call in 2018. 189 applicants applied over the public network. Finally, 87 projects were funded. We had two categories in A and a B. A was really capital works, and B was master planning and conceptual development. So that whole feasibility, which is a kind of a brand new opening for us, in that traditionally we've only been about capital supports and capital investment. So in summary, it was really a broad mixed-use fund that was going to be the catalyst or the glue in between all these other routine capital government funding programs like schools, healthcare. It was really going to be that joining glue in between all that. And I suppose to coin a phrase, it was always about the right project in the right place, rather than the right project in the wrong place or the wrong project in the right place. So it was kind of getting that balance right. And I suppose the specific themes we looked at really were so broad. Again, it was a little unusual. We went from repurposing very strategic parts of city town areas, docklands, warehousing, low intensity use lands for residential, commercial, more effective uses. The whole focus on the fund was to focus what we call IUDs, or integrated urban development. So again, we're very happy to invest in public realm renewal, but not for its own cause, in that you had to have something leveraging off that in terms of urban development or catalyzing further development. So we were less interested in what we would consider routine capital projects, more interested in mixed use transformational projects, which effectively was looking at underutilized assets or brownfield assets in our cities and towns. And of course, we understood that the reuse of existing assets do continue to make a strong contribution to the existing character and the place-making approach at a local level. So very quickly on the left, this is all, the kind of the benchmark. On the left is the strategy under the NPF for national and regional investment, and those areas marked over a certain population size and under. And on the right is the finalized investment strategy by the URDF. So we did match where we said we would make that investment. It wasn't spread thinly on a geographic basis. It was done on a competitive bid basis. So only those projects that were actually going to be the difference at that town or city or regional level, which would have the correct impact. And we also kind of looked at the breakdown of typology of projects. So again, you can see there were 10 types of category of project that we funded, everything from community, cultural, to enterprise, to energy, huge proportion of the IUD, we would call, and also the public realm, because quite often they dovetail together. And then obviously other projects in terms of strategic acquisitions and land development enabling. So very quickly, I suppose, we were often asked at the end of that process, why a particular project didn't meet the standard or didn't get supported. And, the four things actually between not being eligible and being eligible were quite similar, except for one thing. So you either did or didn't respond to the exact criteria of the fund. So they were quite articulate and matched the NPF prerogatives at a local level. The project might have been a routine capital project, so better funded by another department, but obviously not that catalyst or that glue. the project might already have been commercially viable, so there was no point us stepping into what would be supported by a market response, or there might have been an issue with state aid, or the additionality factor was in question. And then those that did get supported obviously responded well to the core criteria. The quality was quite high. The appropriate response in terms of transformative was very well met. And that question of leveraging and additionality was very clearly set out in terms of not a project for its own right, but a project that had maximum impact. And so the lessons learned at the end of that process really was that all the things we know and already understand are very important in terms of balanced regional investment, that you have to have an integrated approach. It should be strategic in nature, and it should be enabling. It should be enabling in terms of the regional, the city, and the local. And just very quickly, just to give you a flavour of some of the projects. So obviously, Cork City, the Cork Docklands, both the North and South Docks, a huge push in the last number of years to look at the revitalisation of those brownfield areas. I think in excess of over 200 hectares, huge opportunity. And of course, we see that as your classic brownfield Docklands regeneration project, probably on a much smaller scale to our European counterparts, but the drivers and parameters nonetheless would be very similar. Limerick City, again, at a strategic level, about facing the city back onto the waterfront, but also using a huge amount of redundant assets in that, backed by the Limerick 2030 regeneration approach, which looks at key urban deliverables, key urban sites. There's about 4 or 5 in a cumulative approach. But what was interesting about Limerick City was it almost had 2 gears. The first gear was that big strategic urban renewal, brownfield enablement, but under the surface was the granular approach to urban surgery, which was about the adaptive reuse of a lot of the properties in the Georgian core of Limerick, which faced huge challenges on vacancy, dereliction, and I suppose a failing public realm, where we were able to dovetail that approach with the public realm investment. Then the likes of Kilkenny, Abbey Quarter regeneration, a much smaller scale ask, but again, huge impact in terms of Kilkenny as a place, in terms of mixed use, focused anchor tenants, and that sort of reuse of redundant assets, which was a former brewery site. And then as we get smaller, you can see the sort of integration of projects in Sligo, which is a town of just over 20,000. And again, it's focused mainly on the public realm, but opening up pocket sites, opening up backland areas, really looking at that compact urban agenda, avoiding the edge leaking, but more about the consolidation of the inner. So again, squares, cultural. What was interesting about Sligo was that they had this really, really useful governance tool to ensure that they remained on target with the various strategies that overlapped with that, particularly from a transport, an enterprise, and a very good climate function in terms of smart metering and lighting and integrated services on the main street. The last 2 then, just to highlight Louth, Long Walk Quarter in Dundalk, which was a very interesting take in terms of looking at a retail centre, but looking at the opportunities for infill to bring living back into the centre of Dundalk, so that it wasn't just a single mono-use in terms of a large retail component. It was about integrating public realm living and other opportunities in terms of green infrastructure within that. And then down to, I suppose, a very, very simple example of what on the surface might look like a routine capital project, redundant military barracks in Ballina, which is in the west of Ireland in County Mayo. It's a town of a population of just over 10,000. This is a very small project, but what it did was it leveraged, I suppose, a problem that we all know on the ground in terms of on-street parking, redundant assets, a large retail piece next to it. And so it was quite, it really, and of course a link into the main street, it just it had so many challenges, how do you approach it? So I suppose the first thing we did was invest in a public realm strategy for the corner onto the main street, back into the barracks, which again was a courtyarded set of 18th to 19th century buildings. And that coupled with a relook at the parking issue, but also how it integrated with the retail area, but bringing uses back into the main square, the new main square, in terms of enterprise, a marketplace, and other things. So what looks like a very small project, but had maximum impact. When you redline that area, you know, very small area, very small investment for us, but actually had transformational impacts at a local town level. So I'm going to end just in terms of the last piece, which is the, I think I'm on minute 20 now, so I have a couple of minutes to elaborate on the end. In terms of enabling, this is where we see, I suppose, the most impact for capital investment. So, you know, you can have a routine capital fund, you can manage it, and it can be quite transactional. But if you don't get involved in the enabling on the ground, it's reciprocal in that it feeds back up to us in terms of how we understand how places are crafted or made, but also in terms of making sure that that investment is being targeted. And of course, again, to share back to the first piece in terms of context, you know, the sort of drivers and the sort of issues that we understand that cities are looking at, the urban enabling role is really, really important. You do need that champion approach. And again, we've been delighted to work with the Land Development Agency to enable key brownfield areas and assets in our 5 cities and other areas. And I think that has an absolute, a very, very useful tool that allows us indirectly to get involved in urban renewal and urban regeneration. We've also invested over the last number of years in enabling what I would consider pathfinder projects. So again, we've invested heavily in design enabling reviews, particularly in Cork Docklands, Kilkenny Regeneration. Kilkenny in particular was born out, as Tony will know, out of an initial design review of the site before anything starts. So sometimes you have to open it up before a local authority writes the brief even. It's very, very important to kind of have that wide angle before you target in. And then you kind of that will inform that integrated urban approach in terms of scale, in terms of the issues at a local level. And then obviously the overriding factors, obviously in terms of housing and that livability factor of cities and towns, adaptation and reuse is a prime issue in places like Limerick City and Cork. Housing design challenges and placemaking. So, you know, it is about broadening the supply choice and affordability, but also achieving appropriate densities so that we have new forms and typologies. In some cases, as the Minister said, you know, one size does not fit all. In some cases, we're looking at hybrid solutions. In other cases, we're looking at more compact urban forms. And the last piece just to end on is obviously we have embarked on a Town Centres First programme. It has been, it is outlined in our new programme of government. We have been asked to look at modelling it on the Scottish Government's Town Centre First approach, which is an excellent approach, and they've been at it much longer than anybody else. We're doing it in collaboration with the Department of Rural and Community Development, based on the NPF template that we just outlined earlier. And I suppose the key emerging factors is that obviously there are 4 pillars to this, and not surprising given what we've learned from the city's approach, is that the governance and enabling structures are going to be essential in terms of how we operationalise a Town Centres First approach on the ground. The economic and social purpose of towns continues to be an opportunity and a challenge, that ensuring future function and viability. And obviously town centre living, so it's bringing back that sense of living in towns and addressing the sort of issues around dereliction and in some cases depopulation that we want to reverse. And then obviously the coordination of investment and resources is critical. And I suppose what's novel about this approach we've integrated is that normally a government department would set up an interdepartmental group. We would develop a policy, then we would go out for public consultation. On this occasion, we've set up an interdepartmental group, but we've also set up an advisory group in parallel, chaired by Minister of State Burke, which dovetails hand in glove with the process as it goes along. So every time the interdepartmental group meets, we hold a milestone advisory group meeting so that we can actually health check and road test some of the issues we're discussing with stakeholders directly, public and private, and they obviously then feed into the various working groups under those 4 pillars that I had mentioned earlier. So my last slide, you'll be glad to know, is really, you know, if we're standing back from this, and again, you know, a lot of people on this seminar this morning will be very familiar with this from a city's perspective, but you could summarize this in 4 key points. I mean, you know, I suppose the key thing for us is that vision factor. You know, we have to move away from business as usual or the transactional approach. We've got to move to a more transformational approach. And that is plan-led, supported by a design-led approach at a local level. So that, you know, analysis of the challenges, tailored with a response that looks at those challenges is essential. It's absolutely, it's dead in the water if we don't have a local champion, centrally and local, to drive that. I know in the towns piece we're looking, and we have built on the town team approach developed through local government. So we do have to have a supporting role at a local level. Obviously, a strategy is very important. So you can have a vision, but how do you implement that strategy in terms of addressing some of the more wicked challenges of function and viability? And quite often, you know, we do know that towns lament the loss of previous function, particularly market towns, but there's a whole new range of opportunities, which I know some of our speakers later on today and tomorrow will talk about, which do look at that green agenda, climate, smart cities and towns, and the sort of enterprise and the sort of response we've seen post-COVID, balanced, of course, with a regional national investment strategy to cities. And then finally, obviously, deliverability. So we do need to have a kind of a comprehensive range of vehicles and special purpose vehicles that deliver on these great plans or schemes as we move along that process. So it is really about that joined up approach really at the end of the day. So thank you very much.